The Sega 32X was a bit of a failure. Alright, it was a pretty big failure, but that was because of shifting market conditions. You see, when Sega first released this thing, it was sold out everywhere. It sold really well initially, and Sega had trouble keeping up with production of the system. Then of course it was announced that the Saturn was coming out, the PlayStation, the Nintendo 64, and Sega's little 32-bit system went to the wayside. It wasn't even really a system either, it was more of an attachment for your Sega Genesis. You see, you had to have a Sega Genesis in order to play one. Add to the fact that Sega ended production of it very quickly, there was only about over 40 games released for it, and the Sega 32X is just a forgotten memory in gaming history. That's not to say that there's not some good games for the system though, because there are. There's actually quite a few. Maybe I'll talk about them another time in an in-depth thing with the 32X. The game I want to talk about today is a game I absolutely love on the 32X. This game was also released on the Sega Saturn, and the first version of it released on the Saturn actually runs worse than the 32X version. The Saturn was a CD-based 32-bit system, the 32X was a cartridge-based 32-bit system, but this game ran much better on the 32X. Might not have looked as good, but it ran better. The game I love is Virtua Fighter 32X. This is actually a sealed copy, this is how much I love this game. So, let's take a look at Virtua Fighter 32X and see if you should pick it up.
Released in arcades in December of 1993, Virtua Fighter was the first 3D-based polygon fighter ever seen. The game deviated from the blood-soaked gameplay of Mortal Kombat and the Hadouken throw in Street Fighter series, and instead focused more on martial arts and realistic fighting styles. The game was an absolute success, so it was a given that a console version would come as well. The first release was on the Sega Saturn in May of 1995, and the 32X version followed after that in October. You would think that the original Saturn version would have been far superior, and that the 32X version would have been missing fighters and features, but this wasn't the case. In retrospect, many preferred the 32X version of the game to the original Saturn version, not including the remix edition that came to the Saturn in October of 1995 as well. Virtua Fighter 32X includes all of the 8 arcade characters in the game and has all of their moves intact. The graphics have a blocky exterior, as common with a lot of games in the 90s that were 3D based, but it gets the job done just fine and actually looks pretty impressive running on the 32X. This was one of the only games for the console that people could identify as not being able to run on the Sega Genesis. Virtua Fighter 32X is a slower and more calculated fighting game, but at the time there was nothing really like it. The 32X used Genesis controllers, and the simple punch, kick, guard fighting scheme made it a breeze on the controller. The depth in the game was made by using intricate combos and button presses to maximize your fighter's moves, and the 32X version didn't skip a beat in this department. The 32X version of Virtua Fighter actually included additional features not seen on both the arcade and the Saturn version of the game. You could choose from additional camera angles, see full fight replays, and the game even featured a tournament mode to extend the gameplay. While the 32X may have had a limited library, Virtua Fighter 32X was one of the biggest bright spots on the system, and was a fantastic port of the arcade classic.
Virtua Fighter on the 32X is a pretty impressive piece of gaming history, because it outperformed the Sega Saturn version. A 32-bit cartridge outperformed a 32-bit CD game. Sure, Virtua Fighter Remix came along after the fact and, outdid this version of the game, but still, initially, this was the version of the game to get on a cartridge. So it's very interesting to think about. Could the 32X have been more successful? Was there more power than a lot of the developers used? I think so. I think the 32X could have been a very viable platform, especially if the Saturn had been delayed a little bit. Well, I hope you guys learned something about a game I absolutely love, Virtua Fighter 32X, and like I said, maybe I'll end up doing another 32X video sometime. As always, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to my channel for more great retro content, and leave me a comment below. I'll see you guys next time. Later.